Hi all, hope we're staying safe and well. Today we're going to look at some Inspector Calls work, but we're going to do it in a slightly different manner than we have for the first few videos within Inspector Calls. Last time I was talking through characters and taking a separate video for each one. The second type of question that you might get for Inspector Calls is a theme type question where you're asked to consider an idea throughout the text and have a look at how it's presented, and you might even be given a specific angle to look at that particular theme. So what I'm going to do, we're going to talk about the theme of responsibility in the play, and we're going to focus on an essay type question. I'm going to show you my essay plan, and then we'll talk you through my key points. So I hope this is really useful for you for looking at these theme type questions. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to analyse the question. So if you have a look up what's on the screen now, this is a typical essay style response looking at a theme type question, which is explore the theme of responsibility in an Inspector Calls. So what we have to do, this is how I like to plan, and bear in mind, examiners like to see a plan because it gives you a sense of argument, it gives you a sense of a narrative of your essay, what are you going to be saying, rather than just putting down every single idea that you can think of. I like to plan like this, where we have lots of different branches going off in different directions, and I like to work clockwise, starting with my first point and then working my way around. So that I can see where are my arguments going and making sure I'm not repeating myself. Within this plan, what I'll be doing is I'll be adding my key points, my key quotations, and my key ideas, and then that'll make a really useful narrative for my essay. Okay, to start with an essay, I usually like to start with an ideology, or like a big idea. What can I say that is the central message of my essay? Now, what I've gone for here is that Priestley is using the play to teach the audience the morals and the duty of responsibility. That Priestley's play is a message all about responsibility, and it's there to teach us about, as an audience, about our own responsibilities and make us reflect on this. Now, some key language I've put down here is ideology. The idea, these are the ideas that are being presented by Priestley. Morality, which is the morals, the values that Priestley's been presenting. I've got didactic, which means that it is something that is teaching us, something that is being taught. And I have socialism, which is obviously Priestley's political point of view. Now, what I would be doing is tying this all together into a neat opening paragraph. It doesn't have to be really extensive, just setting out my big idea that Priestley is teaching us about responsibility through using his play, his characters, and the events within that. Moving on to my first point about responsibility, I've gone for the capitalism is selfish and it absolves individuals from their responsibilities. So essentially what I'm saying here is that the way that these characters are behaving, certainly at the start of the play, is suggesting that they don't feel any responsibility for the wider world, and that is partly to do with their capitalist values, the opposite to the way that Priestley feels. Now, quotations that I've gone for here that would be really useful to look at are things like community and all that nonsense, mixed up like bees in a hive, very awkward, and soon they'll be asking for the earth. Now, all of those quotations are from Mr. Burling, who we could explore as the biggest symbol of arrogance and greed, and someone who just refuses to accept responsibility. In particular, we could look at this idea of mixed up like bees in a hive, the idea that bees can be seen to be the workers, and therefore Mr. Burling feels that he is beyond that, he is better than that. We could look at things that Fatty considers community to be nonsense, community where we are all responsible for each other's behaviours and actions have consequences, he describes as nonsense. We have the fact that soon they'll be asking for the earth, which is quite an interesting point because it could infer that he feels that it's his earth to give to other people. It's him who's in control of the world. So lots of interesting things there, and again we would bring that together. The high level candidates are going to try and use more than one key quotation and sort of embed these smaller quotations throughout their essay response. Okay, my next point I'm going to have a look at is the fact that some characters actually choose to absorb the inspector's message and choose to accept responsibility. In particular, we're looking at Sheila and Eric in this case. So we have some quotations here. These girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. I won't forget, and so I'm really responsible. So we have probably the key quotation that we're going to look at here is these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. We have this declarative sentence that Sheila uses where she's declaring her values that these girls from the factory are people. We have the juxtaposition between cheap labour and people, and the fact that those are diametrically opposed to each other, and Sheila's using that contrast to show how selfishness and greed is a negative thing. We have her statement at the very end of the play, I won't forget. Her and Eric both use this phrase. So we have I will not forget. The fact that she's been taught and she's learnt about responsibility across the play, and the fact that she accepts the changes that the inspector is telling her where I'm really responsible. She chooses to accept responsibility and chooses to reflect upon her own values in this sense. Okay, the third point I've chosen to have a look at is the fact that with a higher social status comes alongside it a responsibility and a duty of care to others. So someone like Mr. Berlin or Mrs. Berlin, who is of a higher social status, has a responsibility to look after other people. So quotations I've chosen to have a look at here are, we are members of one body, public men have public privileges, and the sort of state when the chap easily turns nasty. So the first two here, we are members of one body and public men have public privileges, are messages from the inspector, where he's, in particular with public men have public privileges, the use of that alliteration to give it a further emphasis, is saying that if you are a public person, if you are someone of status and influence, it's your responsibility to use that for the greater good of society. The final message that the inspector gives before he leaves about being members of one body, and it's an old fable about the body needs all of its parts to be working together to be able to function correctly. So the fact that Priestley used this metaphor is really, really significant. We also have a quotation I've chosen from Eric, where he's showing how he uses his social status to act irresponsibly, where we have the sort of state where a chap easily can turn nasty, and that adjective nasty is particularly significant, and looking at how he behaves and how he uses his social status in an irresponsible manner. Okay, the final main point that I've made is looking at, despite the evidence that they are given, some people will choose to not accept responsibility. So with this, I'm looking at people like Mr. Berlin, Mrs. Berlin, and to an extent Gerald. So we've got, you're the one I blame for this. What about this ring, Sheila? And I've done nothing I'm ashamed of. So the first of these quotations, looking at Mr. Berlin when when the inspector leaves, and the first thing he says to Eric is, you are the one that I blame for this. He immediately chooses to pass the responsibility onto someone else, as if your actions are worse, therefore you're more responsible, therefore it's nothing to do with me. Similarly with Gerald, when he comes back with the revelation that the inspector might not be a traditional police inspector, he tries to sugarcoat the things that they've done, and Sheila even challenges him on this and says, I suppose we're all good people now. Gerald, using the symbol of the ring, offers it back to Sheila and says, what about this ring? As if nothing has changed. He's not accepting the responsibility, and he's not accepting the changes that the inspectors asked them to think about their behaviour. Likewise, Mrs. Berlin, before she finds out about the woman she turned away was carrying her grandchild, I've done nothing I'm ashamed of. This certainty about her behaviour and the arrogance, if you like, of that is really, really significant. And some characters choose not to change despite the message that they're being given. Okay, so finally, what I would do to wrap my essay up is to have a look at a conclusion, drawing together all my ideas and what what we learn about responsibility across the play, bearing in mind our starting point, which was that Priestley's using this to teach us about responsibility. Now, what I've chosen to do is have a look at, rather than being completely bleak, Priestley asks us to look at ourselves, and he has some optimism for the future. He sees some hope in the younger generation who have absorbed the message slightly and started to change their behaviour. So we've got things like his final speech, which is "In fire and blood and anguish," that we must learn from what we've seen, otherwise there will be suffering in society. The famous younger generation is how Mr. Berlin describes Eric and Sheila at the end of the play, and in Priestley's mind, in Priestley's sort of message, the young people are a sense of optimism. So we have "The way he made me feel." Sheila remembers and is absorbing these messages from the inspector and Priestley's socialist message throughout. And then finally, the play ends with an inspector's on his way to ask us some questions. So it's forcing us as an audience to ask questions of ourselves, and that's what Priestley's asking us to do. He's asking us to reflect about our own behaviours, our own thoughts, and our own ideas. Okay, so what I'd like you to do today is to have a look at this essay plan. And if you haven't done so already, I'd like you to create your own version of this. And if you'd like to, then obviously go ahead and have a look at writing some paragraph-style responses to this. These types of questions are useful to look at, and they are quite nice in the fact that you get to look at multiple characters in multiple different directions. But essentially, the big thing I would be saying is look at creating a narrative in your essay. Don't just pepper ideas everywhere. You need to think about, what is my main argument, what are my main thoughts and feelings about this particular question. So again, what I'll show on the next screen is the essay question, and that's for you to have a go at. And if you stay tuned at the end, we've got today's film recommendation. Okay, for the film club today, I've gone for a modern remake of an 80s classic that goes beyond the original. It's one of those few occasions where a remake is or a reboot is even better than the first one, and that's Mad Max Fury Road. Tom Hardy is unbelievable in this. Some of the set pieces are absolutely fantastic, and it has a guy who has a guitar that shoots fire out the end of it. So what more could you possibly ask for? It's a fantastic film. Go and check it out. Next time with Inspector Calls, we're going to have a look at potentially a gender response and have a look at how we go about approaching that. And we might have a look at some like introductions and how I've gone about writing this. But until then, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.